governance in India is a formidable phrase that over the years has elicited a wide range of emotions and responses from the various stakeholders in sport. In my welcome address, I think Sean also brought up this point of the reforms report that we released last year, and perhaps 12 months down the line, it's a very apt time to take stock of the changes, if any, that have taken place in this space in India, and also look at the perceptions of sports governance in the ecosystem. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Geoff Schoenberg, who will be speaking on perceptions of sports governance in India, lessons learned, and future directions. A specialist in sports governance, Geoff is a Postdoctoral Research Fellow in sports governance at Deakin University. His current project is focused on understanding and improving sports governance in India. His work focuses on sports governance with a particular interest in the intersections of behaviors, group dynamisms, and strategic decision making. He has also served on a board as a board member in a range of organizations which have made use of his experience in governance.
Thank you, Roshan, and thank you all for being here today. It's very exciting. It's an opportunity to present some of the research and the work that I've been doing here in India over the last couple of years. This is my 5th trip to India. Always the pressure when you're doing technology in front of other people that you're going to just start to click on the wrong thing. What I'm here today to talk about is a bit of sort of my broad project, but more importantly, I'm talking about a specific research study that I did in India in 2017. That project will give a little bit of a background on what, like I say, perceptions of sport governance in India. You have a lot of conversations with people, and people have a lot of opinions, but this is an opportunity to really dive into an actual empirical study of what sport governance in India is. But first, a bit of a broader background on this overall project. So I'm affiliated at Deakin University, but I also work with the Australia-India Institute, which is based out of the University of Melbourne. The Australia-India Institute wanted to sort of reinvigorate the interest of Australian-based scholars into topics in India. So they organized 10 different postdoctoral research fellows to work on different topics throughout India. This might include privacy, solar energy, and for me, sport governance. These are 3-year projects, and it's a really exciting opportunity to create a research foundation or some new knowledge generated out of in the Indian context. My study in particular has received funding from the Australian India Council, which is a part of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Now, I recognize a few familiar faces here. We ran some workshops on sport governance back in January, and Kate Palmer, the CEO of the Australian Sports Commission, was there for that. And that's where the Australia-India Council provided some of that funding. And they also provided some funding for a project that I'm going to talk about at the end of my presentation as sort of the next steps based on what I've talked about here today. So with that sort of overview in mind, let's get into this study and why study sport governance now. Sport in India is growing. It's changing, it's commercializing, it's professionalizing. There's an increase in interest in participation. There's new leagues popping up all over the place. And with this huge growth of attention to sport, people have started to recognize that it's not necessarily only the on-field performance that matters. And in fact, the on-field performance can be heavily influenced by what happens off the field, off the pitch, off the court, off the ring. Choose your sport of choice. With that in mind, when you start to look at some of the common themes and the big issues, is I like to look at the top, the governance of sport. Now, it's easy to sort of use the term governance, and it's a term that no matter where you are in sport these days, it's a bit of a hot topic. Everybody's talking about governance, and this is a governance thing. We need to look more and understand governance, and we need better governance. But we often forget to step back and say, what actually is governance? To me, The simplest way of sort of defining governance is to say governance is the process of direction and oversight of an organization. The first quote you see up on the screen there really relates to that idea of direction. And direction is about strategy, it's about goals, it's about the mission of an organization. Good governance sets the targets. It outlines what an organization is striving to be and how it should get there. These decisions are high-level decisions. It's not necessarily the getting into the fine details of selecting a team, but more creating the parameters of an entire sport development system. The other really critical role in governance is the role of oversight, or compliance, or conformance, or control. And the quote you see there, if management is about running a company or an organization, governance is about seeing that it's run properly. And when we think of this sort of compliance, conformance, oversight role, this can be identified in multiple different ways. So one is making sure the organization remains economically viable. Financially, the governance is responsible for making sure the organization can continue year to year and has long-term financial stability. It's also about legal compliance. Organizations need to make sure they follow the laws, comply with any sort of legislation that is out there. And that's a governance responsibility. There's also an internal element to compliance and control. And that's making sure the organization follows its own rules. What does the Constitution say? What do the regulations, the bylaws, how do those impact and how are those enforced within the organization? Sort of a final level of compliance when you think of governance is the element of creating the guidelines for the organization, putting the policies in place that others in the organization can work within to achieve those strategic goals. So that's what governance is. But how does governance occur? In the different sport management literature over the years, there's been talks of different governance models. This is sort of the process of actually governing. And while these certainly are not the only things that are out there, these three sort of highlight a bit of a continuum of where governance begins and where it's gotten to in some of the more advanced organizations now. And they vary on elements of specialization, formalization, and centralization. I'm not going to go into all the details of this now, but to give you more of a top-level picture. The idea of kitchen table governance is basically that small group of people who have an interest in the organization. They're the ones, the local volunteers, the diehards, the people who've been a part of the organization for a long time and are used to sort of doing all the work. They don't have a lot of resources, and they do it themselves. In this case, the executive committee is often very insular. It's for people from within the organization, and there's not necessarily a lot of looking out. There's no long-term planning because the executive committee in this case is really focusing on doing the day-to-day, week-to-week operations, just making sure you get from season to season. The next level is the idea of a boardroom. And at this point, you start to have a little bit more of specialization within your executive committee. Somebody might take on the role of the competitions coordinator. Somebody else might look after coaching and official pathways. There might be a fundraising or finance director. And they split up the role within the executive committee into different subcommittees. So now you start to see that this executive committee is sort of balancing the role of managing, of operating the organization, but with a little bit of governance by creating subcommittees who have to report back to the executive committee. At the end, this organization is still very much run by the executive committee, as the people doing the operations or overseeing the operations are directly involved in that governing role. The third sort of governance model is the idea of an executive office. And the executive office starts to resemble more what we think of when we think of corporate structures, where you now have a board of directors, executive committee, that steps back and purely focuses on governing, oversight, direction. and they outsource the operations to an executive director, a CEO, or something similar. It might be a general manager. And at this point, they use the policies and tell the CEO, the executive director, here's what we want you to do, and here's the guidelines you have to do it. At this point, a lot of the decision-making comes out of the day-to-day operations, week-to-week decisions, are no longer in the hands of the executive committee. Those are now the responsible professional staff. So let's just take that idea of governance and just kind of pause for a second, and I want to introduce a second idea, the idea of legitimacy. Legitimacy within the sort of the management framework is the idea that, you can see the quote there, perceived appropriateness of an organization to a social system. So when we think of this in sport, what we mean is, do our sport organizations, does a sport organization fit what we expect and align with what we expect of sport organizations as a whole, of the sector? Some of those expectations include an element of democracy. Executive committees are expected to be elected. There's an expectation that our sport organizations exist to further the sport. That can be through a combination of high performance and or grassroots. And there's an expectation that our sport organizations exist to benefit the people participating in sport. So that idea of legitimacy is really important, because when an organization is judged to be legitimate, it has better access to resources. As a simple example, think about the process of recognition and funding that comes along with it, with the ministry. If an organization is recognized, it gets a sense of legitimacy and it's easier to access funds. This can also come through other elements, not just necessarily the formal channels of government funding, but also attracting CSR funding, private investment. When organizations can demonstrate that they're operating and meeting what we expect of sport organizations, they can attract better funding. And also the benefit of legitimacy is they're usually given the freedom to actually act without as much scrutiny. And if things go wrong, there's a benefit of the doubt that, well, the organization's been doing things the proper way, this might have just been a one-off mistake. Whereas when you think of, I was having a conversation earlier, when you think of something like FIFA, when it came out, all the different stories around FIFA and the issues there, not many people were particularly surprised around some of the corruption with FIFA. We all kind of knew it was there anyway, because there's some questioning around the legitimacy of FIFA's governance practices. Now, let's go back and bring the idea of governance back in. And this gets to sort of the question that I was asking in my research project. And that is, what are the perceptions of legitimacy of the governance of Indian sport? This is my 5th time to India now, and every time I've come, the conversation around governance has been advancing. But one of the things that's very clear is that there's a lot of feelings and a lot of passion. I've had a lot of conversations with people around what governance in India looks like and what the problems are. But as they say, the plural of anecdote is not data. You can hear all the stories, but I wanted to actually step back and talk to people and find out, what do people actually in the Indian sports sector think of how sport is being governed? So this is sort of the research method that I did. Given that this is legitimacy is very much about perceptions and governance is a very sort of subjective idea around what's good and bad, I used a qualitative approach by interviewing different members of the Indian sports sector. This included people involved with national federations, this involved lawyers, it involved people involved in private for-profit sport organizations, and non-profit organizations as well. So by interviewing a range of different people, we're able to sort of see what some of the different perspectives are. Interestingly then, I went through all the interviews and looked for key themes, encoded what people said, and these sort of combined to bring some common themes around different people. I'm going to talk about some of those themes today. Unfortunately, don't have time to talk about each and every one. So the first theme that I want to talk about is that idea of governance models. And so as you look at these sorts of quotes, I want you to also consider and think about what I was speaking earlier around that kitchen governance model of most federations, not necessarily all federations or associations or sport organizations, is not necessarily one of governing at the moment. There's a quote there: the federations haven't been able to separate policy from management. Rather than governing, the executive committees in a lot of ways are focusing on managing, on operations. And part of that is due to the structures that are set up. Each structure is a little bit different in some way, shape, or form, but there hasn't necessarily been a systemized introduction of a governance model that resembles the complexity that sport requires. Kitchen table governance is great for small local clubs. National federations require a more professionalized structure. But when you look at the quote there, in orange, the constitutions drafted a long time ago, these constitutions haven't necessarily changed or adopted or adapted to what current thinking around good governance principles look like. And when you have a structure in place that sort of makes it difficult to govern effectively, it does hinder the organization from setting up a governing, managing separation. The other sort of theme at the bottom there is the idea that it's all well and good to have strategy and vision, that element of direction. But if you don't have that on-ground execution team, and in the quote in the gray, if you don't necessarily value the idea of a professional staff looking after the organization, it's going to be very difficult to implement that professional division between governing and managing. That's some of the elements of governing process, the governance model. Another one of the themes was around processes. Governance, as I said, is a process of oversight and direction. It's not just simply set up a constitution and walk away. Governance is ongoing, ever-changing, ever-active. Strategy requires adaptation. Monitoring, control requires constant scrutiny. And when you don't necessarily have the system in place, the structures in place, the consistency in place, that damages the legitimacy of an organization. If I'm looking to donate a large sum of money to an organization, I want to know that they have the processes in place to make sure that my money is going to be accounted for, that it's going to be used in the way that I intended it, and that it's going to further the sport. If there's no process in place, if there's no necessarily financial reporting, if there's no monitoring, then that affects my judgment of the legitimacy of the organization, and it's going to mean that I may not donate that money. A specific example there comes in the quote in the black. The federations don't necessarily recognize the importance of record keeping. This comes from the idea of managing where you're sort of going from problem to problem, week to week, rather than stepping back and having a big systematic approach to what you're doing as an organization. The problem is that to effectively govern and to have all those reporting processes in place, to have a strategic plan that gets reported against, it can be really difficult. And a lot of federations and organizations don't necessarily have those resources. The quote in the gray there from a member of one of the national federations says, we know these principles, we know these systems, we just don't have the time or the energy to be able to put them in place. We're trying to get operational, we're trying to get problem after problem after problem solved. The next issue is the issue of accountability. And accountability is really important because accountability almost provides the idea around where people can make their judgments of legitimacy on. You can look at governance models, you can look at governance processes, those can be in place, but if people don't necessarily know what they're producing, it's hard to make the judgments, it's hard to have the information on how to say, yes, this organization is legitimate, it's being governed effectively. And there are some problems within this system for Indian sport. The idea of sport being a state subject and not necessarily a central subject means that it's difficult to necessarily enforce accountability from throughout the organization or from all organizations. There's also, within sport, there's the issue that the national federations and the state associations are often interlocked. State associations are expected to hold the national body accountable through elections. They are the members who are supposed to sort of make sure the national federation is acting in the best interest of the sport. And at the same time, the national federation is expected to provide guidance, assistance, and help to the state associations. But when you have people serving on the executive committee of a national federation who are also presidents of their state, it's very difficult for the state to kind of turn to the federation and hold it accountable. That sort of duality of roles is a systemic problem that prevents accountability from occurring. Again, the quote in the gray there highlights the issue of resources. It's all well and good to say these are how we're going to make you accountable, these are the rules that we want people to follow, but you again need to be able to follow up on them. You can put out guidelines, but if nobody's going to actually enforce them, or inquire about them, or push on them, it causes problems. So thinking of those three issues, what are some of the common themes between the governance model, processes, and accountability? A lot of the governance models, a lot of the processes are outdated to current sport governance thinking. There's an adherence to sort of old processes that requires change. But that can be really difficult because, of course, people who are in power or in places of authority never really want to give that up. And constitutional change makes that really difficult to do. There's resources is a common theme. Lack of people, time, and money to actually implement good governance principles. And finally, there's issues around structures. These are structures within organizations. Think of things like term limits, as well as sort of intra-sport issues. So the accountability and the guidelines between national federations, state associations, districts, etc. And then, of course, some of the legal issues around what laws can be passed, what can be actually enforced. The nice thing is that in the different people that I spoke to, there are some ideas on what sort of solutions can be implemented. In terms of setting governance on a better pathway, the idea of really emphasizing that role of strategy, of organizations clearly discussing and outlining their goals and what are they going to be accountable to, giving the pathway within a federation for all parts of the sport to follow. By communicating that, it both can rally everybody within the sport towards a goal, and it also provides a measurement accountability for our sport organizations. There's the idea of the democratic system, and that ties into the sort of systemic reform needed to ensure that the democratic process is actually an effective democratic process. That people can be elected based on the merits of their work or the merits of their promise. And finally, at the bottom two quotes there talk about the idea of moving professionalization. The quote in the gray particularly interests me. We need professional management, and there has to be a custodian. The executive committee is the custodian, and the staff become the management. And once you have that sort of separation of governance and management, you have better opportunities for success. Some themes identified in the different future directions is that idea of professionalization, paid staff to actually manage, and allow governing bodies, the governing committees to actually govern. Reform is needed. Structures and processes need to be put in place to sort of allow change and create change both within organizations and the entire system. And also really important is the idea of communicating this. Many organizations are doing things right, but there's deceptions that they're not. Being open, being transparent, being accountable, and telling people what you're doing. Letting them make judgment, allowing yourself to have a few issues or flaws, but being open to those sorts of issues. Really critical. Now, that's sort of the conclusion of the research presentation. What am I doing next? So as I mentioned, the Australia-India Council has provided funding. I've got one partner who seems to be sort of lined up already with me and looking for other organizations who want to sort of examine how they're perceived within the sport, asking questions around their members, and then work with me to actually implement some changes within how they're governing. So if you're a sport federation or North Sport Federation who's open to some change, have a chat with me over the next couple of days. One of the other things I'm looking to do is I'm launching a podcast. I'm not sure it's available in iTunes yet, but hopefully some of the other podcast providers are available. It's called the President's Lounge. And this provides an idea around what sport governance, some education on sport governance, and a resource for people to use. So that sort of concludes my presentation. We've got a few minutes here now, and I'll happily take some questions. I covered everything. Solved all the problems. Natalie.
Did people bring up quality of personnel?
So the question there was about sort of the people engaged in governing. And that was one of the themes that I would have liked to include it, but don't necessarily have enough time. What was interesting is when I talked to a lot of people casually, people say we need more athletes, and the people on the boards aren't necessarily always doing it for the right reasons. But when you actually go into the data of what people were talking about, there was a really interesting discussion in there around the idea that you need a broad set of people engaged in governing. So yes, there are criticisms levied at the fact that a lot of executive committee members are politicians or government bureaucrats. But there's also a lot of identification of the importance of these people, that they are able to network with the government and provide, can sort of make things actually happen. At the same side, there was a recognition that there is a need to have people who have that experience in sport involved with the governing of bodies here. It's interesting, it's almost a flip problem of where Australia was at a few years ago, where Australian sport used to be completely governed by athletes. It was all ex-athletes, and many ex-athletes are brilliant and know what they're talking about, and many clearly played sports that involved them getting hit in the head a lot. And so there was an idea that sport in Australia needed more professionals and outsiders to come in to help govern. Whereas it's the opposite issue here in India, where there's a lot of bureaucrats, professionals involved, but they don't necessarily understand the sport side of it. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, that was a good presentation. Thank you very much. Just one question. I think somewhere along the way you had mentioned that there were some federations which are doing things right in India. I'm just curious to know which they are.
Well, one of the things that I do when I interview everybody is a lot of it is related to confidentiality. So I can't necessarily go out and say who I spoke to or what I've done. What I can say is that there are some organizations who are taking a look and are like Hockey India has a CEO. They have an executive director. They have a system in place where they have a board that's governing rather than other organizations have gone through constitutional reform to sort of try to start introducing different term limits and things like that. There's organizations that revamp their voting structures to create more democratic systems. Again, I can't necessarily say exactly which organizations are doing what and everything off the top of my head, but there are some out there that are doing, trying at least making the effort for good change. And nobody I've spoken to is necessarily happy with the status quo. Everybody recognizes change is necessary. It's just a matter of how best to make it happen.
Did you actually go about meeting with people who actually invested in the sport, people who actually created economic viability for these sports?
I did meet with one organization that is heavily invested in sport. I had a good conversation with them, and it was very interesting to hear their sort of perceptions, because some of the things they highlight is the idea of they want to invest in sports where they see that there's an accountability in place, that there's structures in place that can actually, like they say, they can trust that their money is going to be well used, or that they have a partner that isn't going to renege on the deal shortly thereafter. So they do look for sort of a stability in their governing structures. Does that address your question?
Sorry, still a follow-up. How much is about outcomes and how much is about process? And if you're going to go through the process of reform and put in a lot of these structures, are you giving up on maybe 5 years of development while all of the changes are happening? Or is there another way of looking at it in terms of saying, these are the outcomes I want, I don't really care how you get there, but holding institutions responsible for results rather than process, is that another way? Did any of those themes come through?
It's a difficult question, because when we look at strict form of what's called policy governance, and this is the John Carver model of governance, where they talk about the board essentially should give the guidance to the CEO and then step completely away. And it's up to the CEO to determine whatever they want to do. That doesn't necessarily always apply, because it's really important to have guidelines on how things are done. At the end of the day, governing, what we want out of sport organizations is results. But governance is only one element that produces that. You don't win gold medals based on good governance alone. You certainly lose gold medals based on bad governance. So it's a tricky balance to try to figure out. It depends on what level of the system you're talking about as well. It's easy to say we want really strong, good governance, and we want the results. But at the same side, if you start to erode the values of sport, I know of a few cricketers in Australia who a little bit focus too much on results, shall we say, than the process, and are getting to have a nice little year's vacation. So that's where you start to see the balance of at what point do you say, yes, we want results, but within still playing alongside the rules. How are we doing time-wise? Last question.
Yeah, hi. So you talked about governance, and you've said that state associations need to hold the national associations accountable. Do we go back down to the bottom level, that is the districts or maybe clubs, and say that that is where the accountability and governance begins, and not only the top-down approach, but maybe from the bottom up? So what is your view on that?
I agree. It was interesting. So I attended a conference called Play the Game, which is a very large conference hosted in Europe, and a lot of journalists, a lot of sensational a lot of focus on FIFA and the International Olympic Committee and issues there. And I sort of asked the question, I can't imagine that the International Olympic Committee and FIFA, where you have these people who have been involved with issues, have been perfectly clean and have done nothing wrong, and then show up at the International Olympic Committee and then start pocketing bribes. It does stem from the bottom up. Now, it's tricky because at what point, one of the key issues around governing effectively is resources. To ask your clubs and your districts, which are really struggling to try to maintain and continue to do what their task is to make sure that the athletes that they're serving have the best opportunities, it makes it really difficult if you start saying you have to focus on governing up. But it is what's needed. And some of that can be simple education around letting districts, clubs know what sort of questions they have the right to be asking and what sort of information they should be seeking from their state associations. It is this sort of difficult model where the organizations with the most resources, the national federations, they have the ability to often overwhelm sort of the lower bodies, particularly when you have India with so many different states. It's easy to sort of build coalitions that way rather than necessarily having just one state who can actually really truly ask important questions. I'm not sure if that addressed your comment or not. I think that's it for my time. I'll be around for the next couple of days. Excited to have some more conversations with different people in the room. Thank you so much for your time.